Hi, I'm Jonah, and this is a Discover New Sounds video for the minor blues scale. And this is a great scale for the native flute. It's already based in a pentatonic minor scale, so it already has kind of this emotional, quality to it that the blues often has. And so you add the blues into it and it just really works. Now I'd consider this to be kind of a upper beginning to lower intermediate level scale to learn. And mostly there's a cross fingering. It's not a very complex scale, but there's a cross fingering in it that if you haven't played with cross fingerings before, it'll take a little time to learn the dexterity of that particular sequence of notes in the scale. But I'd encourage you to give it a go, because it's cross fingering really opens up a lot of possibilities on the flute. Now I'll play through the scale once to show you physically what it looks like on the flute, and then I'll put up the tablature and talk a little bit about that, and then I'll play an improvisation example using the scale, talk a little more about the scale, and then I'll show you another improvisation example. This is the minor blues scale fingering chart, and the first note in any scale is called the tonic note, and that's this note here. And the tonic note is also the note that the scale is keyed in or based on. So, for example, if your flute is in the key of A, then when you play this scale, you'll be playing an A minor blues scale. Or another way to say it would be the minor blues scale in the key of A. Or if your flute's in the key of G, then you would be playing a G minor blues scale or a minor blues scale in the key of G, and so on. The most challenging part of the scale is the cross fingering, going from this note to this note, and then from this note back to this note. So if you haven't played with cross fingerings before, just take a little time to teach your fingers the muscle memory here. Just kind of move back and forth between these notes, play some other notes, and then go back to it, back and forth between them again. Just to teach yourself the muscle memory so that when you're playing in your improvisations, you can spontaneously move through this transition easily. Now, something that's interesting to note is that if I take this note out, we're really just playing the minor pentatonic scale, which is that scale that we all learn when we first play the native flute, and that a lot of us play for years and years. It's a wonderful scale. And what's interesting is we just add this one note back in, or this one note in, and it really shifts the feel of the scale. So it's kind of a important note to emphasize when you're playing. You'll see in my improvisations how I emphasize this note, because it really kind of gives the scale its feel. And I'll talk more about that in the last part of this video as well. Another note that some of you may not have played before is this note here, and this is a high note on the native flute, and so it's often not played when you're just playing the minor pentatonic scale when we're first learning the native flute. So if you haven't played this note before, then you might need to, one, practice the fingering, the dexterity of it, of closing these three holes and not the ones above it or below it, just to learn the muscle memory of it. But the other thing is that sometimes, depending on the flute, you might need to pop it into the higher register using a harder tonguing. So a tonguing that's more like a ta, ta, where you're really emphasizing and putting a lot of pressure at the beginning to pop it up to that higher register, versus a soft tonguing, ta, ta, that you might be using on other notes. When you're going into the higher tones, a lot of times it needs that in order to pop the flute up into that higher tone area. So if you haven't played with that before, then play with that a bit, so that again you can use that kind of spontaneously in your improvisations and it comes easily and fluidly. And the last thing I'll mention is this last note and then the alternative fingering for that note that's below it here will be won't be true in tone on the bass tone flutes. And that's just a product of their size and their bore and the physics of the particular larger flutes. So if you like the way it sounds and you hit those notes, you play the scale and you hit those notes over the octave here and you like it, great, go ahead and use it. That's what it's all about, if it sounds good to you. If not, then skip it. Or if you're playing with other instruments, then usually I would skip it as well because you might sound off because you'll be out of tune. So you'd play up to this note and then you would just not go above it. So scales often have a set of notes within them that really define the sound of that scale. And so in this scale, it's the cross fingering and also the note above the octave. And so the cross fingering note is this one. So when you add that note in to the scale, it really gives it that feel, that bluesy feel to it, kind of jazzy, bluesy feel. It's also the note above the octave, so when we hit here, it also gives it that similar feel. So you'll want to use those notes quite a bit when you're playing this scale. You hit them a lot and really intertwine them more than other notes or equal amount, but really emphasize them, I guess is the way to say that. It's also, there's sequence of notes. So if you notice this sequence of notes, kind of has that walking blues, I think is often called, feel to it. So that particular sequence will also be a real characteristic sequence of notes for this scale. Now there's all kinds of ways to play the scale. You can do all kinds of stuff, and improvisation do improv on it and find all kinds of stuff out of it. These are just kind of the characteristic, classic, kind of bluesy feel of this scale that I've found. There might be others that you find, and I hope so. That'd be great. Now the one thing I should also mention is that going over the octave is not going to work as well or possibly at all on a lot of the bass tone flutes. They don't hit the notes over the octave very true, so they'll be either really flat or even like a half step or even sometimes a whole step or a half a note or a whole note in the wrong direction. So with the bass tone flutes, you might only get that one octave, meaning only up to this note. So you go. You just wouldn't get that one more note over. And it still works really great. And it's really cool to play this scale on different tone flutes because you'll feel it brings out different rhythms, melodies from the instrument itself. Like this one, the style that my improvisations are in really is pulled out by this flute. If I play a bass tone flute, it'll have a different feel because the flute asks for a different feel and its voice sings a different feel. And high tone flutes will really be different as well. And they'll be they just have a livelier feel in general, so the melodies that they play are going to be different. So if you have different tone flutes, experiment with that, and if not, enjoy the one that you have and keep playing. I hope this really gives you a lot to discover on your flute.